Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game. And these are the most played cards of 2018. That's right, for the entire year, these are the cards that were played from hand the most. Now, I've partnered with hsreplay.net to bring you some exclusive statistics. Normally, you can only find these sorts of stats on a 30-day period, but hsreplay.net hooked me up, gave me the yearly stats so we can do a series of videos over the next few days reviewing the entire year and breaking down some of the best and worst and most popular and least popular cards in the game. Now, in this video specifically, I am going to be focusing on cards that were actually played onto the board. So that does introduce some biases, if you will, towards low-cost cards, neutral cards. Legendary cards don't get much benefit here because there's only one of those in your deck, so you're less likely to draw them and play them. Now, that may not be exactly what everybody's looking for, but that's the focus of this video. That said, at the end of the video, I have included a couple different filters or lenses to look at this. So if you're curious about other ways to break down, popularity or deck inclusion rates, use the link in the description to skip to some of those alternate views. But for now, let's see the 10 cards that were actually played the most in Hearthstone over the last year. Starting at the number 10 spot here, we have Druids Swipe, which was played over 25 million times in hsreplay.net's data set, and that's a lot of times to see a swipe. But if you think about it, really seeing any class card on this list is actually rather impressive because class cards, have roughly 1 in 9 as many chances to be played as a neutral card because they can't be played in other classes. But as we know, 2018 was the year of Druid in a lot of cases. It's becoming the year of Hunter at the end, but for most of the year, Druid was absolutely everywhere, and all variations of Druid ran Swipe. It's great early to mid-game removal. It's an awesome damage card when combined with things like Malagos and Floop. So that flexibility's made it a staple for Druid for a long time, and no real surprise to see it on this list given Druid's dominance throughout the year. Up next at the number 9 spot, we have Life Drinker at 26 million plus times played. And this is noteworthy because this is a Witchwood card, which means it wasn't actually available throughout the entire course of the year. So this list is going to be a little bit biased against cards that were released this year, particularly cards like Rosticon's Rumble cards, because they've only been out a month. They just haven't had that many opportunities to be played. But despite missing the first few months of the year, Life Drinker actually still making the cut because, of course, of its prominence, probably in Shudderwalk Shaman, a card that in a deck that's been played a ton in 2018. But Life Drinker has been flexible enough to show up in other spots, and that's really what gives it the boost to see play on this list. Also, as a 4-cost card, it tends to get played earlier in the game, so games don't end before it gets played in a lot of cases. For all those reasons, it just barely makes the list at the number 9 spot, which is really rather cool for a Witchwood card. And then moving on to the number 8 spot, this one is unbelievably impressive with Giggling Inventor being played more than 27 million times. Now, keep in mind, I'm showing here the post-nerf version of Giggling Inventor. Most of the ones being played were at 5 mana, the pre-nerf version, but this is a Boomsday Project card, which means it missed over half the year, and it got nerfed pretty quickly too. So really, Giggling Inventor only had a very small window to actually see any popularity. And despite that small window, this card was just so pervasive, so absolutely dominant in the meta that it still cracked this list. It was played that much, that often, even as a 5-cost card. That's a pretty high-cost card, too. So Giggling Inventor, a card that is probably the most impressive and remarkable of all of the cards on this list. If we were normalizing this list, so essentially, benefiting cards that came out later in the year and, detracting cards that had been there the entire time, Giggling Inventor would without doubt rank number 1 because it got played so many times in such a short window. So like the plays per day ratio of Giggling Inventor in that window was insanely high. So clearly a card that deserved to be nerfed as we all knew it was, and this data represents exactly why that's the case. This thing was everywhere. Up next is Wild Growth, another Druid card played almost 29 million times in 2018 in HS Replay's data set. Again, this is the post-nerf version you're looking at, and a vast majority of these plays have been achieved with the pre-nerf 2-mana Wild Growth, and really not many have been played since in the short window we've had here, just a couple weeks since the nerfs hit anyway. But again, this just indicates how dominant and how powerful Druid has been and how key to their success cards like Wild Growth were. Not to mention it's a 2-mana card, so it gets played very early in the game. And not only that, but it's mulliganed for often and kept in the mulligans often. So it's even more likely to see play than something like Swipe, which maybe wouldn't always be kept in the mulligans and comes a little bit later in the game. So clearly a card that is been dominant in Hearthstone for a very long time. Data like this, again, supports why it was nerfed. Blizzard probably saw the same sorts of numbers. One of the most played class cards of all time, if not the most played class card of all time, I'd say. So a fitting nerf and a card that's really not a shock at all to see on this list, despite being one of very few class cards. Moving on here, we have the Tar Creeper, played almost 30 million times. And this guy is just that perfect early to mid-game minion that fits in so many different game plans. Actually good in aggressive decks to protect those early threatening minions. Great in defensive decks to help you stabilize against your opponent's early aggression. One of the best designed and most widely played cards I think we've ever seen in Hearthstone in its standard format era. Everybody loves Tar Creeper for great reasons, I think. And one of those cards that I'm surprised actually isn't even higher on this list, but you'll see there are some very, very played cards ahead of the Tar Creeper here. But a card I'm happy to see here, frankly. I think more designs like this in Hearthstone would be fantastic, and such a cool card that has been like this since day one when it came out in Journey to Unguro, and will remain played up until its standard format rotation. Great, flexible, awesome, strong card. And then up next here, we have our last class card of the list. It's the Kobolds Librarian for Warlock, played over 30 million times in 2018. And again, I think here we're seeing the benefit of a low-cost card that tends to be chosen in the mulligan and kept often. Not only that, but Warlock has seen all kinds of different decks play Kobold Librarian throughout the course of the year. You got zoos, you got cubes. It's not an even Warlock, of course, as an odd cost card, but there's been enough other variations of Warlock that love playing this thing on turn 1 that it shows up in almost every Warlock game that's played. Unlike a 10 cost card, which may never actually get played, Kobold Librarian's always hitting the field. So a card that's not too surprising here. I think one of the best cards in Hearthstone, frankly, just does so much for a 1-cost card and fits Warlock so very well that to me, it's not much of a shock to see this guy as the top-ranking, most played class card of the year. Moving on to the number 4 spot, we have Fungalmancer, which is really the go-to tempo follow-up card that Hearthstone has had since its release in Kobolds and Catacombs. So many aggressive decks love to use this thing, particularly in combination with 4-drops like Saronite Changing, which might be on the list yet to come. But anytime you can stick a minion here or there, Fungalmancer creates great trade opportunities, great just raw pressure to hit your opponent in the face really hard. And that's why it fits so well in all of these different zoo-style, aggressive, board-based sort of decks, coming in at almost 31 million plays. And keep in mind, this is a 5-cost card too, so it's not quite as easily played as some of these 1-cost cards. Some games might end before turn 5, might be harder to slot into a turn with free mana for something like Kobold Librarian, where it's super easy. Fungalmancer's a little more awkward, so for it to rank this highly at its cost and the way it works, really rather impressive, and a note just how remarkable and how strong this card has been in Hearthstone. Maybe even a card that could have gotten nerfed along the way somewhere. This thing is really, really good. So now we're into the top 3, and we're looking at Firefly with almost 37 million instances played. You'll note that's quite a bit higher than our previous card, and that's just because Firefly, it's a part of that tempo Hearthstone package with Fungalmancer and Tar Creeper and Saronite Changing, and Fungalmancer, this sort of perfect curve where you just have this great plan and this great minion-based strategy where you just curve out beautifully and you overwhelm your opponent. Prince Keleseth has often been a part of that as well. Keleseth might be on a list like this if he wasn't a legendary and very hard to find, but that has been a dominant strategy in Hearthstone for a long time, showing up in decks like Rogue and Warlock and various other things. Firefly is central to that. Also, this card, just because it creates multiple little bodies in one, it's great for things like Rogue with combos. It's good in any elemental decks that show up here and there. It's just the ultimate flexible 1-drop that so many different decks have run. It was also a great counter to Odd Paladin, which was dominant in 2018. So lots of stuff would just toss it in there to trade into a couple Silverhand Recruits, or maybe 4 Silverhand Recruits with the Flame Elemental. combination. And that's why you see this thing played so much. It's a one drop. You keep it in your mulligans. Every deck runs it. That is a perfect recipe for a card that's the third most played card in all of Hearthstone over the course of the entire year. Firefly has been dominant in the game. Moving on to the number 2 spot here, I was a little bit surprised to see our buddy, the Stonehill Defender, with over 38 million play instances. And the reason for that is I didn't think Stonehill had quite as much flexibility across, deck archetypes as something like Firefly, traditionally run in more defensive decks. But then I realized an interesting interaction with Stonehill Defender is that often he turns into another Stonehill Defender in the late game, or sometimes 3 Stonehill Defenders. So in some instances, because of the way this data set is achieved, Stonehill Defender might actually double up on himself, counting multiple times. It's kind of hard to separate that out, I guess, or hsreplay.net, or at the very least, that's my understanding. So, you might be adding an extra 10 million or so here just from double instances of Stonehill, but I'm okay with that. First off, this is just an arbitrary sort of analysis anyway. We're not making any subjective value statements about these cards necessarily, just talking about what the data shows. And in this case, Stonehill sometimes turns into Stonehills. That's a function of the card. That's much like, other cards that summon copies of themselves or add copies of themselves to hand. That's cool with me. So Stonehill actually shows up at the number 2 spot. And that's just because so many decks love to run this thing. It's that free cycle, early interruption, stall out your opponent's board while maybe creating yourself a Lich King or some other crazy big awesome Tyrian or Obsidian statue, or Sunkeeper Tarim and Odd Paladin, I think, was particularly popular in 2018 as a choice. And that means between things like Odd Paladin running this and then other control decks running this, Stonehill Defender maybe actually is rather flexible and does tend to show up in lots of different archetypes. So it's been one of the go-to cards for a long time, one of those staples you can toss into any deck and feel pretty good about it, I guess. And that's why it's the number 2 card. And then finally, moving on to the number 1 card here, we have Saronite Chain Gang, another centerpiece card in that tempo package that's been so strong in Hearthstone, and a card that's gone beyond that because it's been played a ton in Shutterwalk Shaman. And when you consider the impact of Shutterwalk Shaman, all the different tempo and even decks that like to run this thing, its combinations with cards like Fungalmancer, you can start to see why Saronite Chain Gang has been played so darn often. Now, some of you out there might be thinking, well, wait, Regis, maybe the data is counting both Saronites being played as 2 instances every time you play Saronite Chain Gang. But keep in mind, if you cut that 49 million in half, that would put it lower than Swipe on our list. And I think we all know Saronite Chain Gang was played more than Swipe in 2018 because it's not a class card and it's been absolutely everywhere. There really just are a lot of Saronite Chain Gangs out there. Shutterwalks, Rogues, Tempo decks, Zoo decks. Everybody likes this card. And that's why it ranks so high, because it's been around throughout the course of the entire year. It's a neutral card. It's been a big time strategy for lots of people. It's defensive. It's aggressive. It does a little bit of everything. It's not quite as common post-nerf, obviously, in these last couple weeks. It's not going to be a good card the first few months of 2019. But throughout the course of the year, this was absolutely just a staple Hearthstone card. And that's why it's number 1. Indeed, how long can this go on? Okay, so that wraps it up for cards actually being played onto the board and how often they were played, which I know is not going to satisfy everybody. Some people are going to want other ways or other approaches to look at this data. So I've prepared 2 others based on what hsreplay.net sent over to me with this yearly data set. The first of those is looking at cards based on their deck inclusion percentage. So for instance, a card like Giggling Inventor was at one point included in like 50% of decks. That's really high. Other cards might be included in 5% of decks. That's really low. But you can take an average over the course of the entire year to see which cards on average were most likely to be in a Hearthstone deck. And that is this list. Nourish at number 10, Lich King at number 9. And keep in mind that this removes the penalty to legendary cards, because legendary cards are included in decks. This is a binary yes or no, isn't included or not. 2 inclusions in a deck for a non-legendary card don't boost the inclusion rate. It's yes or no. So Lich King shows up on this list because clearly it's been the most popular and consistent legendary throughout the course of the year. Flanking Strike comes in at number 8, Kobold Librarian at 7, Giggling Inventor at 6, Tar Creeper at 5, Stonehill Defender at 4, Firefly at 3, Fungal Mancer at 2, and Saronite Chain Gang at the number 1 spot. And you can see some of the things we talked about a little bit as far as cost of cards is concerned. There were some reshuffles here. For instance, Kobold Librarian moved down the list because the cost of a card doesn't matter when you're including it in the deck necessarily. I mean, obviously, you still tend to curve out towards lower cost things more often, but as far as, internal consistency of the data set is concerned, Librarian doesn't get some unnatural benefit by being a low cost mulligan keep style card over something like Tar Creeper, for instance, or Giggling Inventor. It gets included at the same rate as a 5 cost card, all other things equal. And that's why it moves down the list a little bit. Similarly, we see things like Stonehill Defender move down the list just a tad as well, because some of that replayed from hand aspect where you're playing the card a second time because you got it off your Stonehill Defender no longer matters in this angle on the data, because you include 2 copies max of Stonehill Defender in your deck. You either have it or you don't. Extra versions added to your hand don't affect the numbers at all. But you can see Saronite Chain Gang still came in at number 1 as the most popular card throughout the course of the year. This thing on average was being included in more decks than any other card, which absolutely crazy how good it's been. Clearly the nerf was fitting and appropriate. So I think this is a cool lens on the data. And then there's one more, which I wanted to look at cards that actually came out in 2018. Because in some cases, it was unnaturally biased against cards that debuted in 2018 because they didn't have as much time or as many months to accrue the play rate. Now, this goes back to played from hand data like we saw with our original list, but these are the 10 cards from 2018, so from 2018, based on their played rate. So Dynamatic at number 10, Shutterwalk at number 9, which sounds impressive at first because it's a 9-mana class card, both of which make it very hard to play. But when you consider Shutterwalk sometimes in one game might get played 10 or 15 times, suddenly it makes sense why it's on the list. Witchwood Grizzly at number 8, Doubling Imp at number 7, Soul Infusion at 6, Ziliax at number 5, Hinchland Thug at 4, Ferocious Howl at number 3, Life Drinker at number 2, and somehow Giggling Inventor actually comes in at number 1, despite having, 4 months less time than Witchwood cards and also getting nerfed fairly quickly as well. It still got played so much in that short window that it managed to take the number 1 overall spot. That is totally insane. That card was completely unfair. I don't understand how it made it so far. Now, keep in mind, Witchwood has a natural advantage because it had 4 more months on this list, so you might see a few extra Witchwood cards that might not exist if you stretch this out. I think Ziliax, for instance, would move up if you kind of normalized this data set and tried to account for how many months each of these cards were available, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to present it as is because we're looking at the year as a whole, not arbitrarily trying to set values or subjective analyses of these cards. So this is what the real raw data from hsreplay.net captures, and a pretty cool list, I think. A neat little exploration. I think Ferocious Howl in particular was the most surprising to me. Couldn't believe it got played so many times, but I guess Druid was just so darn dominant that there it is. Hinchland Thug is kind of cool too. Again, I think it's been a consistent, Witchwood offering with Rogue for so long that Odd Rogue in particular has been around so much that there it is. It made it into the top 4, in fact. But another neat little slice of the most played cards in 2018. Now, that said, I did want to real quickly look at hsreplay.net to show you guys how to see some data like this. This data was exclusive. They ran it for me to look at the year in total, so you won't be able to find yearly numbers like the ones I used in this video, but you can still look at 30-day windows or 7-day windows to see how popular a card might be. So let's real quickly jump into some HS Replay action. Okay, so I made my head tiny again so you guys can see, and much like in my previous video sponsored by HS Replay, we're going to jump into the card section, and in particular, I want to show you guys exactly what these definitions mean. So for the primary part of the video, we basically use the times played metric over here in this column, the number of the times the card was actually played. But in that second level analysis near the end of the video just a second ago, we looked at included in percentage of decks, and that gave us the 2 separate views where some things moved up and some things moved down, and things like Lich King, for instance, got a bump, because it's included. Yes, no, it's not based on the number of cards or anything like that. So Lich King moved in. As you can see, Lich King still a fairly popular card in Hearthstone right now, included in 17.5% of decks throughout the latest patch. We can also go to 7 days, 14 days, latest expansion, a few different sorts and filters here. And right now you can see Flanking Strike, a particularly played card because of all the different versions of Hunter that run it. And if we stretched out the next 6 months, Flanking Strike might be one of the top 3 or 4 cards in that same list because of its popularity. But we were looking, and even then, Firefly still, Ziliax is gaining a lot of ground lately. It's a very popular card too. Stonehill still up there. Now, Saronite Chain we won't see because it got nerfed, so it's far less popular than it used to be. But you'll see some of these staple cards, even now, over the last month or so, still just being dominantly played in Hearthstone. So this is a great way to go in and see what kind of things people are playing and the stats for all those different things. This is one of my favorite views in HS Replay, so I would encourage you to check it out and learn something for yourself as well. Now, all that said, that wraps it up for me. I feel very lucky to get a cool look at this data that is really not available anywhere else as far as I can tell. Surprised by some of it, not so surprised by other pieces, but I'm curious what you guys think. What surprised you here? What caught you off guard? What cards did you think would be on this list but weren't? And vice versa. Share all those thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.